So our guest today is Dr. Rille Raaper. She's an assistant professor at Durham University, and her research focus lies on higher education policy and practice, consumerist positioning of students, so students as consumers, and student politics. She's also well published around those topics, and also on assessment policies and political agents. So today she's going to talk about the student agency and the student unions, which will be a very interesting topic for us, and welcome also to our participants from the student union.
Thank you. So first, thank you very much for the kind invitation for me to share some of my recent thinking, but also research around the notion of student politics. And I really I'm looking forward to sharing some of my thinking and some of the work I've done, but also to kind of receive your feedback and thoughts. So if you do have to leave earlier, so feel free to get in touch with me anytime, because I'd really appreciate your thoughts. So first of all, my paper today draws on kind of a number of different things I've been doing recently. So it started with my quite small British Academy project that explored the ways in which a small selection of student unions in England from Russell Group universities engaged with the consultation processes leading to the Higher Education Research Act 2017. So that was my empirical part of the project, and I'll come to that today as well to provide some example and evidence. But also there has been wider kind of conceptual thinking I've been kind of doing and recently writing about, and there's a paper under review at the moment where I'm looking into what do we mean by student politics and political agency in current kind of market-based higher education system. So I've been doing some thinking around that as well, which I'll come today as well. And obviously, the current state of kind of neoliberal higher education in England, which deserves attention as well. So there are a number of lines of arguments that I want to make today. And I've divided my talk into three interrelated parts. So I'll start by kind of problematizing the current state of English higher education sector. And what I want to look into, the kind of the new types of policy making, a little bit of the kind of the idea of governing by numbers and different stakeholders who feed into policy making, and also the kind of the idea of university education turning into a commodity, students as consumers. And I'll do that by drawing on two policy contexts, particularly one is then the Higher Education Research Act 2017, but also Consumer Rights Act 2015, so the kind of the consumer protection law that constructs students as consumers. Once I've done that, I want to move into the part two, where I want to look into some of the conceptualizations around student politics. And that's the most perhaps raw or new in my own thinking as well. And I'll do that by looking into the works of Hannah Arendt, and with an idea of questioning, not proposing the idea, but questioning whether there is arguments to say that students have been depoliticized or are depoliticized. And then moving on to bringing in some of Foucauldian theorization to look into actually the new forms of, and more kind of professionalized forms of student politics as well, and political agency. So I'll do that a little bit as well. And then part three, to provide an example, which comes then from that small British Academy project, and looking into then how does it play out within that particular context. So let's see how we get on. And obviously, if you have any questions in the meantime, you can stop me as well. Or if I speak too fast, then please to stop me. So part one. So first of all, I suppose we cannot speak about the state of English higher education without looking into the concept of neoliberalism, which is obviously now in common discourse as well. And my take on neoliberalism has always been rather, kind of Foucauldian, where we look into neoliberalism as something that is a mode of governance and which is paradoxical in terms of promoting freedoms, free choice, free market, do whatever you want and you'll succeed. And then on the other hand, introducing increasing number of regulatory mechanisms that actually kind of constrain that idea of individual success or failure and our behavior within that context. And I very much like the quote from Raditz here, 2013, where he speaks about neoliberalism as a combination of Stalinist hierarchical control and so-called free market, which in some ways I think captures quite a lot. That it's often to do with illusions of freedom than actually having quite a lot of freedom. And then how we all are governed by numbers. That's most of us, whether we are staff or students, have numbers attached to us. When you're staff, and what's your student satisfaction rating? What's your ref rating? what star publications do you have? And then, the issues around teaching excellence framework, where we can categorize universities, and the proposals of the knowledge exchange framework. So a lot of other things. For example, if you read news yesterday, then also the focus now on the longitudinal educational outcomes, LEO data, and categorizing universities, or proposals to categorize universities based on how high-skilled jobs they lead to. So all kinds of numbers that actually feed into governing us. And within that context, obviously, lots of people have been speaking about, including myself, looking into what does to universities then that become often kind of providers or service providers. Education, is that a commodity, or what is it then that can be sold and purchased? And then how students are positioned within that context, which I think is extremely complex and not that straightforward. And I hope I don't want to patronize within that context either when I come to talk about students. But now, in terms of the policy making obviously has changed as well. And Janja knows much more about the kind of the network governance than I do. But in terms of kind of looking into how universities or individuals or processes are now governed by new patterns of networks of governance, and who are the stakeholders that actually form the decisions that get made at the state level or the institutional level. And often these come from different state sectors, whether it's private, whether it's public, increasingly private, of course, and third sector, and creating those bloody divides and different interests that then intersect. And it becomes almost kind of, on the one hand, you could argue that it's a democratic way of making policy, including different stakeholders. But obviously, there are different hierarchies and heterarchies within that system, that whose voices actually get heard. So the kind of policy making which has changed. And I think an excellent example of that is how the Higher Education Research Act 2017 got developed. And this is the act that I don't think I have to say much about that, but this is the act that introduced the Teaching Excellence Framework, encourages alternative higher education providers to enter the sector. Some of the documents have said that if Google would want to open up a university, they would be very welcome to do so. Also, the establishment of the Office for Students came from that act. So I suppose these are the key things that came with the Higher Education Research Act. But before the Act, which is a legal document, extremely dry to look at or read, there were two documents that kind of reveal some of the ideological underpinnings and the processes, are the Green Paper, which is on the left, which was released in November 2015, which was my primary starting point. And that was, which was basically government proposals sent out for consultation. And they were, of course, sent out to kind of traditional stakeholders like universities and students' unions, which was my focus of analysis at the time, research councils, lots of new think tanks, but also, interestingly, to Rolls-Royce or IBM UK, and those kinds of private stakeholders that were seen as important to be consulted. 359. Yeah. Oh, yes. No problem. So those kind of stakeholders that we're seeing almost like is as important to consult as students' unions or universities. And so that was the Green Paper consultation, which asks those stakeholders to respond to the consultation. And lots of students' unions did that, and that became my focus of analysis. And then on the right, which is the White Paper, which was published in May 2016, which was supposed to be a response to that, but actually saw very little change in terms of the proposals. So that's the kind of the way into that. And I suppose the reform itself has been described as placing students at the heart of higher education, which sounds absolutely lovely. Who would disagree with that? But you don't obviously have to look very far to look into how students have been constructed within that reform, and they've been constructed, of course, as consumers. And if you look into a couple of quotes here, the first one, which is from the Green Paper, which argues that the TEC, which is the Teaching Excellence Framework, will increase students' understanding of what they're getting for their money and improve the value they derive from their investment. So there's very strong positioning of what students are doing, they're investors, they invest into the future, and of course they then need to be assured the value for money. The similar kind of meaning that comes from the white paper. Competition between providers in any market incentivizes them to raise their game, offering consumers a greater choice of more innovative and better quality products and services at lower cost. Higher education is no exception. So again, this idea of, it's some sort of market game, and it's like any other markets relationships where we need competition, where we need those different providers to enter that game in order for us to have better quality products, which are then the courses. And higher education is like any other, like buying your shoes. So it's a very strong kind of message of students, consumers, universities, providers, higher education as commodity. But there's nothing new about that. This is like, it's not even these days worth an analysis, because that's kind of common rhetoric, and it would have been kind of odd if those documents would have, kind of been anything different. Because the idea of, students as consumers has been around for a long time, and I opt for the term consumer for a couple of purposes. First of all, because you could use the term customer as well, which some people do. But I often, when I write about things, I use consumer because that comes from the consumer protection law. So it's kind of nice to link with the policy discourse. But also, I think consumerism and consumption is a broader term than being customer, which is a very transactional. With the consumerism, you could also look into how education gets consumed. What's the relationship with learning and teaching there? But people have argued the portrait of students has been coloured by neoliberal developments for some time now. I've borrowed a quote here from Williams, 2013, to explain consumers as students as consumers as someone who, as a result of financial exchange, considers themselves to have purchased and is therefore entitled to possess a particular product, in this case a degree, probably, or to expect access to a certain level of service, which probably is staff and resources, I suppose. So that kind of very quite transactional definition, I suppose. And in terms of looking at how it then plays out, what's the market logic or expectations there, I suppose there are assumptions that students will use those various technologies that have been set in place, those kind of performative technologies, whether these are the national league tables based on MSS or are they international league tables, and then act on those to choose the best value for money. And there needs to be choice and differentiation so that students as consumers will act on those things. But then there's this other line of argument that comes that if students really act on it, then they will pressure universities to develop the best quality courses. So it's almost interesting to look into how it's almost essential for that type of market relationship to students buy into that logic, because it makes the market cycle work. But in my work, and like many others, I never kind of argue that students necessarily are consumers, because I don't think that's the case. What I'm speaking about is how they're constructed through policy discourse. And obviously, I do believe so that if you call somebody with a particular name for long enough, they kind of start believing aspects of that, or it has some effects. But I don't think it's fair to speak about students as consumers or customers in a kind of, in a simplistic terms as such. And that kind of comes from that kind of positioning of students as consumers, which reflects in the Higher Education Research Act is very much drawn on the Consumer Rights Act 2015, or Consumer Protection Law, I suppose, in common language, which is overseen by the Consumer and Markets Authority, which is the watchdog or regulatory body that oversees the market relations in the UK. For example, the CMA was the organisation that banned, for example, Sainsbury and Asda from merging because it would be bad for the market relations and prices and consumers. And it's the same regulator then that oversees how consumer law applies to higher education. And since 2015, they have been extremely forceful in making sure that universities comply with consumer rights and students would be aware of their consumer rights. And on the right-hand side there's a little poster that they have produced, which is a 60-second summary of undergraduate students' consumer rights. And of course, the assumption is that no consumer has more time than 60 seconds to get to know their rights, which is quite interesting as well. And the language there, you can't really read that, but it's really interesting in terms of how vague language it uses. A couple of first quotes there, for example, choosing the right course And university is an important position. You're investing a lot of time and money, and it can be difficult to change if you're dissatisfied. Dissatisfied with what? So it's a kind of very ambiguous use of language there. Or knowing your rights under consumer law will help you to get the information you need when choosing a course in university and help to protect you if things go wrong. Again, what things go wrong. So there's a lot of that kind of ambiguity and catchwords which they think that students will like, I suppose. But in terms of the what the consumer protection law does in terms of regulating student and university relations, it regulates three aspects. First one is the information provision, so that applicants before they enter university would have accurate information to make their decision. So what the universities promise, so that they wouldn't overpromise, because otherwise, the students could sue them. So that aspect. The second aspect is terms and conditions. So what are the rights and responsibilities of students and university? So that these would be clear. That what am I supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? And that would be regulated under that law. And the third aspect is complaints handling. So if things then go wrong, whatever that means, what are the institutional procedures and what are the national procedures to deal with those things? And overall, they're not bad things. I mean, I don't think that universities should promise things that they don't deliver. So some good things have happened under that law. For example, where I did my PhD in Glasgow University, they had to stop banning students from graduating if they had library debts. So basically, those kinds of things, or having hidden lab costs that you can't really ask them to pay more if you haven't said that this is the case. But we also know, I don't know if you've followed, but quite a number of cases now when students have actually taken universities to court. For example, I think the most famous case is the Anglia-Ruskin one, where a student sued the university for promising high-quality teaching and high-quality courses, which actually they proved was not the case. And I think they got £60,000 as a reimbursement.
Sorry about that.
And then the other case, which I think is still ongoing, it's in the University of South Wales, I think, which is to do with a student suing the university wanting to get £200,000 because they were awarded with third-class degree while they thought that they should have got better outcome. So those kinds of things which are interesting to look at, and universities are obviously extremely concerned. And now with the strikes that we had and strikes that are coming up, this is again, in terms of are now the terms and conditions being broken, and probably are, and students can sue universities based on those kind of basis. So yes, some of the good things come out, obviously, from those kinds of protections, but also how does it construct students is interesting, that it needs to be the same law that protects you when you buy shoes that protects you also in higher education. And here are just a few photos that I've shown these posters. I've shown these before, or in some cases, so you may have seen it. But these are again available from the government website, but also from the CMA website, produced by the CMA to relate, and these relate to those key three aspects. Have you had unexpected changes to your course? Information provision. Have you been given information about how to complaint handling, to make sure that students know their rights? You can go and download them. But interesting here is the visual representation of students, isn't it? Because I've never come across with students like that. And I really have no idea why they've chosen a photo with a guy in a cardboard box. This does not make any sense whatsoever, that you would portray students in that particular way. And that's kind of interesting on its own as a way of looking at how students are presented and constructed through those types of quite high-stake discourses and documents. So yeah. But again, making sure that students would know their rights. And I was surprised, actually, when I did interviews with students' unions, that must have been the spring 2017, that some students' unions did have posters like that, and information from the CMA on the walls and things like that. Not all of them, but some of that information was presented there. Now, what does that then mean to moving towards student politics and political agency? What does it then mean to students' unions? And there's plenty of research, or it's still quite limited research, but it's an emerging research, and including my own, I suppose, when we've looked into students' unions as new stakeholders, who often are constructed through those policy discourses as safeguarding consumer interest. Okay, I'm not saying that this is always the case, but that's how often they're perceived by the universities or policymakers. And I think one of the recent speeches that Chris Skidmore, the universities minister, gave, where he was actually presenting and speaking about students' unions as the most professional organizations, and they follow this very professional approach, constructing students' unions in a particular way. And then, I don't want to romanticize here and say that, that the real student politics took place in the 60s and 70s when students were revolting, and not all students were, and obviously that was the past as well. So I don't want to argue that, that students are depoliticized, but there is evidence to suggest that there has been a shift towards more representational forms of practice. So for example, closer relationship between unions and senior institutional management. You don't have to look far in terms of how universities are scared of students and students' unions in some ways, and the involvement in different committees and boards, at least in my own institution where we can see that. The increasing number of professional employees, often highly paid employees who work in students' unions, chief executives, things like that, and managing various social events and support facilities, which is kind of to do with promoting good student satisfaction, which may then well reflect in the national student survey, and things like that. So there is some evidence, and some would argue, I don't, but some would argue that this is an evidence that student unions have been depoliticized. I just, maybe there is some truth, but it's also different type of organization, I suppose. There are some changes in terms of that relate to that environment we're part of. We all have to kind of adjust. So that's the kind of the context here. But I want to move on now to dig into deeper here, which kind of looks into what do we mean by student politics or political agency as well. And first kind of thinking about how would I define political action at this moment of time. And what I've been doing recently is I've been looking into the works of Hannah Arendt. He was a political theorist, political philosopher, German-American, and particularly her work around the human condition. So she published that book, Human Condition, I think it was 1958, where she categorized or spoke about 3 core human activities and action as part of that. So she divided those core human activities to labor, work, and action. And labor for her was something that is related to cyclical nature of self-preservation. So things we do to survive and exist. And these are to do with bodily processes, but also consumption, cyclical types of work we do just to carry on and be able to survive within the context we live in. Work, which relates to kind of fabricating the human world, and that's to do with fabricating economic outputs. We could say, like, as academics, we fabricate and produce constantly publications and, research grant applications, but also, various tools that get produced. So that's the work, that we all do some work as well. And then action as the highest level of that human condition for Arendt. But Arendt would also speak about that action is extremely complicated and difficult. First of all, for her, action should not include the elements of private interest. It should be primarily public and primarily, serving the public as well. And she would argue that action requires certain preconditions, which are on the slide here as well. That first of all, to take initiative, to begin to set something new into motion, which means having courage to actually start something completely new. She would also argue that the outcomes of action are always uncertain, unpredictable, and that's the kind of the risky part of that you need to take risks to be able to cope with whatever you set into motion, and it's not under your control. And Arendt would argue that in order to cope with that, first of all, you need to have a society or a context that would forgive you if things go wrong. And that's quite an interesting concept I'm coming in a moment. She would also argue that action always takes place in web of relations, so you need other people. It's a collective element, because you need plurality. You need different interests to come together to serve the public good. And then action is irreversible, which is then related to this idea of outcomes being unpredictable. And you need to have then this courage to accept that you cannot go back or have the element of forgiveness. And now within that context, if we would think about how many of us would be able to practice action in that sense. Particularly students within a context where you pay so much money, often students have high debt, extreme stress in terms of being able to get a job after that degree, mental health crisis that we all kind of are aware of. So how could action like that play out? And probably very little. And that's quite interesting to look into from an NTM perspective in terms of that kind of traditional action which would serve the public, which would be, revolts and demonstration and things like that. And so it kind of starts allowing us to question that are students depoliticized in a kind of traditional sense. And Anna Arendt also introduced the term society of labour. So basically what she argued, which in the contemporary society for her was 1950s and 60s, but I think her ideas are extremely relevant for us, because what she was arguing was that within a kind of massified society, the consumer society that started to emerge, we're increasingly forced to focus on labouring. Consumption, immediate gratification, that you consume, you buy something, you get this gratification, you move on. And it's constantly the cyclical nature of life that we engage with. And she would argue that within that context, where we're constantly focusing on immediate necessity and the speed that comes with that, our capacity for action and speech has lost much of its former quality. And that's where she introduced the term animal labourer. And I've been playing with this idea and questioning with a question mark. Could you speak about students as animal labourers who need to just survive within this context, rather than, be all creative and courageous, because it's extremely difficult within that context. And Arendt would argue that the last stage of the labouring society, the society of job holders, demands of its members a sheer automatic functioning, as though individual life has actually been submerged in the overall life process of the species, and the only active decision still required of the individual were to let go, so to speak, to abandon his or her individuality. So this idea of if we are the job holders, if we are the students in that insecure position, that how do we engage with that automatic functioning? And I have here Dole in 2005 explains this further by arguing that for Arendt, spontaneous initiatory human action is suppressed by the normalizing pressures of society. Once life, that is sheer life, becomes the primary concern of politics. So if we are constantly concerned just with our own survival, within whatever context we are, that how much or how little we can actually engage with the politics and political action that is for greater good, beyond our own immediate interest, which could be tuition fees, which could be anything that is just, essential to survive. So interestingly, from that perspective, there is very little research that would look into contemporary students and politics. A little bit is emerging in New Zealand, where Sylvia Nissen has written a really interesting book, which is called Student Debt and Political Participation, published in 2019, which I believe is based on her PhD, where she engaged with students and looked into what types of political action they engage on campus. And she argued that the students that she interviewed tend to engage with more uncontroversial, non-partisan, non-political action, which is professional in its nature. And I have a quote here from one of her participants who argued that, the thing we're always told not to put stuff on Facebook that our potential employer might see. Yeah, it's like that. You just don't want them to see that you've been politically active. So this kind of idea of, if I'm too courageous here, if I get this wrong, nobody will forgive me. I probably won't get a job. I might not even get a degree if I get that wrong. So the risks are just so high stakes within that precarious context. Staff is precarious, but I think students are in an extremely precarious condition as well. Obviously, what she doesn't do, and what I haven't done, and which I want to do a little bit further in the future, is to look into the kind of the single issue-based student politics, which I think is really important. And I think that is something to look into if you even focus on climate change, or if you look into particular single issues that keep popping up. And I think there is something to be said about that not all has disappeared. But basically, from an Arendtian perspective, we could, or one could argue that there are elements of depoliticization, because it's almost impossible to practice action in a particular way. But I don't want to do that. And what I want to do is that I want to look into how then that traditional action has been transformed into different types of actions, and sometimes can look into more micro-level politics as well. That's what I do by bringing in a Foucauldian framework and moving from looking at acting in concert, which is like Arendtian idea of action, to more subtle forms of political action. Because if Arendt has a very kind of normative understanding, if action doesn't happen based on those categories she highlighted, it doesn't exist. But from a Foucauldian perspective, we could argue that all private matters are political. Anything that is private is political. Power is everywhere and nowhere. It's diffuse. It moves beyond. And from a Foucauldian perspective, you could also say that political subjectivity, who we are as individuals, becomes the precondition for agency. And he would argue that it soon appears to me, while the human subject is placed in relation of production and of signification, she's equally placed in power relations, which are very complex. And some of that complexity I would like to unpack now. And from his perspective, for example, sabbatical officer or student as political subject is always in a production and in a process of being produced. In terms of it's normal that it changes over time, because from his perspective, there are nothing universal in any of us in terms of as subjects. Only various technologies through which the individual is created, forces that act on us, but also the opportunities we have to navigate and resist these. And that's the kind of, I like this Foucauldian idea of duality when the subject, individual, is subject to someone else by control and dependence. That there's a lot of stuff that doesn't depend on us, and we are subjected to those forces. But also, we have some agency through, we're tied to our own identity by conscience or self-knowledge. That yes, we can revert some of that power acting on us, and subject them differs depending on interaction with social context. And I would like to the other element, so when I said that I'd like to do a little bit more work on looking at the single issue-based politics, I would also like to look into social media and kind of what role, how does politics play out in social media, which you know very little about, and it exists there, I'm pretty sure. It's just very difficult to capture. And that's the kind of the place, the context may have changed as well. Yep, and that's my kind of working definition in one of the papers when I was looking into that particular project that I'm coming in a moment, when looking into sabbatical officers' political subjectivity, the ways in which they then understand, engage, and negotiate policy in the study is always dependent and in a constant process of being produced, borrowing from Judith Butler here, and they need to navigate the complex and changing field of student politics that is increasingly shaped by neoliberal policies and unionist positioning of students. So trying to look into what is then possible within that particular context without assuming that there's nothing there, which would be naive to do anyway. So now I'm moving to the final part 3, which is looking into then the example and providing some examples from the sabbatical offices that I engage with. And it draws on then my project, which was primarily set up to trace the actions that sabbatical officers took to inform the policy consultation leading to the Higher Education Research Act 2017. So I was primarily wanting to do that. And I was hoping, or what I was thinking at the time was that I may be able to capture the next wave of student demonstrations, which really wasn't the case. So actually it started with that idea, but it then got much more complex conceptually, and also then looking into if there is no clear action or different types of actions or difference between that, so what is there then? And I was looking into what it then means to be a sabbatical officer and engaging with that political event at the time. And what I did was that I first did critical discourse analysis of written responses that 5 student unions that were from Russell Group universities, which sets its limitations, obviously, and then you asked that they submitted to the government consultation. So I did that. And then I did interviews with representatives from these student unions. But as you'll see in a moment, I will be speaking about interview data today, because I became quite paranoid when I did the analysis of written responses, because they were extremely similar. First of all, I thought, I've already read it, how come they're very similar? But they were, of course, very similar because they were all relying on the NUS's National Union of Students template. So there was very little difference, so there's no point of analysing and comparing them if there is not much difference there. But methodologically or theoretically, then again, I threw on this idea of discourse being a space of positions and of differentiated functioning of subjects. So through discourse, we are positioned in a particular way, but we also create ourselves through language quite a lot. So yes, but first of all, the overall kind of feeling from that project and talking to those sabbatical officers was really strong opposition to the reform, what was going on. It was, it was very clear from the very beginning from all of them that they hated it, and it genuinely upsets me. I find it really worrying. The whole thing is a catastrophe. Burn it. There's very strong opposition to that, and they wanted, there was no kind of manoeuvring there. And it often related to this idea of what the universities or higher education will become if that reform will go through. And let's see what will actually, maybe that's what's going to happen. Let's see. But so one of them was arguing that it's going to be like Tesco, Sainsbury's, Amazon, and Odeon Cinema all own universities, except we're not quite sure which business owns yours, and you're paying so much debt. I don't know. It's going to be a nightmare. All universities will be different. We'll charge different amounts, and you'll have this really weird comparethemarket.com website, which will say things like you can get this gold course at this brand uni and then pay this amount, and we'll all have to pay health insurance. And let me stop here for a moment because there's a lot in that quote. So first of all, it's terrifying, obviously, but there's a lot of emotion there, but also it relates to those key aspects of the reform. So first of all, for example, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Amazon, Odeon Cinema relates to this idea of alternative providers entering the sector very much, that whoever wants to open up a university, welcome to do so, because competition has been encouraged. Then this idea of we'll charge different amounts, which relates to the original proposal when they wanted to adjust the tuition fees based on deaf outcomes from Silver Gold, that Gold universities could charge more. This hasn't gone through, but at the time, obviously, we didn't know, so they thought that that will go through. Then comparethemarket.com, I'm sure those websites already exist, but probably that relates to what the TEF will become. This TEF, whole exercise will produce that new league table in some ways. And I love that link with the we'll all have to pay health insurance, because that was the kind of punch at the end, because at the time when I was talking to the sabbatical officers, the junior doctor strike was going on. So it was very much into discourse relating to what was going on in the world. And then that interdiscursivity came through a lot in terms of how the reform was seen as part of wider, the world going in a wrong way. And it's interesting because when the written responses were submitted, this was, when the world was maybe a little bit better placed. But when I did the interviews, that's when the Brexit vote had already happened and Trump had become president. So it was a very strong interdiscursivity and relationships with that. So first of all, they really saw the reform being part of the Conservative Party politics, that it's clear that the Conservatives have a particular view of higher education, one which is not formulated by talking to higher education practitioners that we did to students, but one which was sort of constructed within the right-wing press. So this idea of fake news and being misleading was quite interesting as well. So that was kind of one kind of aspect, how it related to the society more broadly. Or then the other quote here, that I sit on the university's trustee board, and when the decision went through that the university was going to submit itself into the TEF, I cried. Like it was after Trump had just got elected and president, and I was like, oh my God, the world's going to shit. So this whole idea of being worried about the whole world. And in some ways, when I was talking to them, this kind of whole message gave me an idea that, that there will be some really strong radical action emerging from there, because they really, hated what was happening. But interestingly, when I started looking into how did they engage with that consultation, or how did they try to resist that? There was a very strong influence from the professional actors, from the students' unions and the NUS. And like, for example, speaking about how they went about developing that written response, they spoke about that, we would obviously have the kind of leadership, yes, we were involved, but then staff members can help in terms of, the actual writing, the research and things, and helping to write stuff. Or the other person arguing that, I wrote the response apart from question 20, which the CEO of the union wrote, but then the rest were all penned by me, but with the staff support from our advice team and from democracy and representation and other areas of policy work. And obviously I have to emphasise here that those unions that I engage with had enormous resources and enormous expertise from professional members as well, so that kind of probably shows that. So that's one thing, that there was a strong influence from those professional members in those students' unions. And the same with, as I already mentioned, the National Union of Students who sent their template. And again, because I interviewed NUS as well, and within that context also it was the professional side, the permanent kind of professional side of the NUS who was in charge of producing that template, and like we argue that I can't really underestimate the role that the NUS has played in all of this. Like we would just be a load of student unions fumbling around with some documents that we don't really understand without them. So there's very kind of strong relationship there. And it was interesting, I was questioning and talking to them about why was that the case, where did the other students fit in it. And it was interesting, they argued that they really struggled to get students involved. So this idea that, you know, that it's such an unsexy topic, or some students were really in favour of the reform, saying that I welcome the higher education green paper because, you know, if it's presented to you like that it's about value for money, you know, that the better quality universities will be rated as gold, and then you pay more for them, but it's a lower quality, you pay less fees, and who wouldn't want more choice, things like that. So they felt that lots of students went on board with them to reject the university, the reform. And the other aspect was not really being able to work with or rely on their own institutions. So they were very disappointed that Russell Group University and their own universities did not do anything to reject the reform. So they argued that, you know, Russell Group universities also have tried of hundreds of years of not doing anything different. So like the idea about doing some radical action against something is very anti-Russell Group. So what I've tried to argue in some of my work looking into that, they couldn't really form alliances beyond those professional communities in some ways, because it was very difficult to get students involved, and it was very difficult to work with the university who had opted in for the reform. So going back to the theoretical aspect, then we could argue that those professional discourses, those professional actors, produced the possible field of action for those sabbatical officers. They governed who they could become. And I think Foucault nicely speaks about how governing people is not just about forcing people to do it. You know, those sabbatical officers spoke about how they, you know, that they had leadership, they worked with those professional actors. So there is the kind of the complementarity between the techniques which impose coercion and through which the self is constructed by ourselves. So there is agency in it. That was the field of possibilities for those individuals I talked to. So who did they become then? So I tried to kind of look into what type of political subjectivity or agency got constructed. And I would argue that there was a lot about becoming a lobbyist in some ways, that they really engaged with politicians, which was quite interesting for me. That some of them went to Westminster Policy Forum, and, you know, they were trying to make a very kind of strong argument. And there's a lot about measurement, testing, evidence-based approach that you debate, that you put forward an argument that has a lot of evidence. And that was actually very characteristic to written response as well. It wasn't about, you know, like the interviews where they hated things and they were quite vocal about it. The documents itself was very much about this is what research shows, this is what policy has shown, and we argued through that. And the other person who said that I went to the House of Lords, which there was an element of laughter there, that seeing kind of that it's maybe not what officers did in the past. So we approached some members of the Lords who we have connections with and have monitored the debate and have been supportive of certain amendments. So again, they kind of engaged with Lords, and they also started voting to Lords letters to kind of ask them to vote against the bill when it went through the Houses of Parliament. So they hoped that the Lords would obstruct the majority vote in the House of Lords, which didn't happen, but they tried through that mechanism, which is a very professional way of doing that, I suppose. And the other bit, which I've tried to argue, is they also became quite rational negotiators who went back to the consumer protection law, which I started with, and used that in some ways, really claimed it and owned it. And there's a couple of quotes, and they're very different in terms of the perceptions of the consumer rights. The first one, which is quite interesting, which is, so certainly the fact that we will now be able to sue the university to deliver us a substandard experience or something that they didn't promise really means that we have, as student unions, have a stick to beat the university to actually do what they should. So there's a very strong claim that we own it, and we actually don't even need to negotiate much because we have that right and we keep the university on track. And the other quote, however, is more apologetic, I suppose, in terms of arguing that I find myself in bizarre situations that, you know, she didn't like that situation. In kind of university committee meetings where I'll be using the logic of consumers to argue for something good for students. So, I'll be saying you're charging students $9,000 a year and you're also asking them to pay for the printing. What's that about? So using the consumer logic to do something good. And actually that's what I've been thinking and writing about as well, that can we actually use some of those neoliberal technologies to revert and act against? And I suppose we can. So I'm not saying that students' unions or students shouldn't be using consumer logic. I think those rights actually can be empowering. So they don't, I feel kind of sorry that that's the case, that we need to draw on consumer logic to do something good, but it has an element of empowerment there, I suppose. So yes, so that's the kind of who I was looking into, who did they become, how did the political agency emerge? And interestingly, why their actions were very similar and how they perceived themselves. There was quite a bit of difference in terms of their contentment with that and whether they found that process, kind of satisfactory. So, for example, the Union 5 here, who was quite pleased how it went, and they said this is all we could do, and it has been in some ways successful, and we shouldn't have any kind of radical moot points and ideas, and average students don't want to engage with those ideas anyway. They just want to have a cheaper pint and have a cheaper experience. So there's very kind of that type of idea that it's getting too radical anyway. We have to have that evidence-based approach and argue for a cheaper pint. The others, however, were arguing that we failed, that we didn't actually succeed at all, that the reform got accepted. We delayed some bits, but that's not really success. And they wanted to kind of see a grassroots activism to be developed, and I thought that the NUS should be like a fighting political union that is, essentially kind of forced to be reckoned with. And I also, interestingly, used the same person, described the NUS as a national union of SABs, like National Union of Sabbatical Officers, and arguing that, it actually needs to activate students more broadly. So interestingly, what I've been looking there, or thinking about is that to what extent then it's a kind of struggle against the forms of subjection, who the sabbatical officer have become. And it seems to me that the second one here, that they're longing for the political agency of the past, or not being happy to be who they have become. So those kinds of elements. And now just to conclude, basically, just to kind of briefly summarize, that I suppose what I've tried to argue is that discourse is a space of functioning for subjects, whether it's students, whether it's staff, whether it's students' unions, and often it is to do with consumer logic, it's to do with increasingly also evidence-based approach, professional discourses and actors, who then start shaping and limiting the political agency of students with sabbatical officers. And also within that case, there was a kind of evidence of lack of support from students and universities, which then limited what actions were possible. And that produced a possible field of action within which certain types of agencies were informed. But there was elements, so I don't want to be utterly negative and say that it's kind of all doomed, which I don't think is the case. But there were those differences in terms of what they thought they should be doing and what they would have wanted to see happening in terms of contrast, such as delaying or destroying the reform, wanting a cheaper pint or a revolution. So those kinds of elements are there. And I suppose it all kind of shows, in some ways, that there is fragmentation of student power, in some ways, because students have enormous power from the legal perspective in terms of consumer law, but it's diffused because collectives have been broken down into individuals, which is what neoliberalism does. It does the same with other types of trade unions. And then it raises a question that whose voice gets actually represented within those policy consultations. If students don't get involved, then whose voice is it? The professional or wider student voice? So I think I'll stop here and would be happy to have any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Rille. So the floor is now open for questions and discussion. So if you want to engage with Rille after you leave, you can also get in touch. question for someone. So just to repeat that, if people following by distance can email questions to address@seminars@lancaster.ac.uk. Okay. Any thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah. No, I was interested in what you were talking about. Like, I suppose a lot of it I can relate to just my own dealings with Lancaster University Students' Union. And yeah, the more I've dealt with it, the more just shocked I've been at just how impossible it is to get anything to happen. I've been doing it from the outside as just a student, and we managed to get the first annual general meeting in years to happen last term, and passed loads of radical motions, and then the officers just refusing to act on them. And it's just amazing the sort of the influence that the professional staff have, and the crossover between professional staff of the Students' Union and university management. And it seems to be very much that the Students' Union is just sort of a department of the university. I'm just wondering, is that just normal in every Students' Union across the country? And how do you even start to challenge that? Because
it's very interesting, and I don't have solutions, but I think you've captured what this project was, and obviously it's a lived experience for many people who engage with student unions. But I think I can understand where it comes from, because it comes from trying to contain, because student voice is so important for universities, and they're fearful of students. Then containing that in the student unions, professionalising these, and kind of having some power over it, and then involving, even often in a quite tokenistic way, in different committees, and the same ways in student reps and course reps and things like that. You almost kind of contain that voice and power within that, so it serves the purposes of university and higher education sector more widely. But you're absolutely right that actually getting done anything meaningful is extremely difficult. But in some universities, what I've noticed is that tons of student societies are popping up. So it's almost shifting away from student unions to those identity-based or individual groups as well, in some ways. So it kind of, where is the student actual voice being represented? But obviously, student unions have control over a lot of those societies that can emerge. But yeah. So yes, I don't have an answer, but
I think that's something that we're definitely seeing in Lancaster at the moment. Is that sort of the left and student organisers have tried to do things within the Students' Union, and it's rapidly given up on that and moving outside to try and do things.
And it's even, people told, because when I started with that project, and I focused on Russell Group Students' Unions particularly because their responses, there were more of their responses available. So I don't know whether it meant that they were more engaging with the consultation process. But interestingly, however, it would be really important to look into post-92 universities as well, which in my understanding and experience are even more consumerist. And this is the kind of interesting thing, that here we speak about universities or student unions that can afford political action in some ways, but in some other places the consumer law is, it's all that gets emphasized.
John?
Thank you for that. I'm trying to think about some of this from a sort of historical perspective, and I'm sort of thinking about the role of student unions, say in the 1980s, when the Thatcher cuts were being applied to universities and so on, and then a bit more recently, the reaction of student unions to some of the changes in fees and so on, post-Deering and then 2010 and so on. And I'm interested in how you see the role of the union as changing. One of the things that strikes me, listening to you and thinking about that, is a sense that, if I think back to 1980s, in a way, the enemy, the opposition was government. I get a sense from some of your comments that, in a way, I'm interested in this sort of idea of whether the union is sort of trying to sort of work against the university or the government or both, and whether that's a shifting feeling.
It's a really interesting question, and I don't think I know exactly, but in terms of the historical thing, it's quite interesting to look into things that I've been reading and working on, looking into, even starting from kind of 68 and 67, is in some ways, some of the problems or some of the issues with students' unions these days are results of some of the successful student protests at the time, because what this one element that they were protesting at the time was to have a say in university governance, or having a bigger involvement governing university, but also higher education nationally. So they got that voice, but that also meant it became more contained within those professional forms. So it's a kind of legacy of that. Then yes, the 80s, but getting into 2010-11, which is the kind of the last big student demonstration, we could argue, and people would argue, that what kind of primarily motivates students at the moment is the fees. And that's the only kind of or the main kind of thing that can activate a student resistance in some ways. But in terms of the question about who are they resisting or who are they interacting with, I don't really know. I suppose I have a feeling that it has moved towards kind of the institution and the students' union rather than the state and the students' union, but I don't have any evidence. It's a kind of thought process. But maybe because that's how they're constructed mostly, because they're sitting on those university committee meetings. So they're kind of positioned like that. And while from the governmental discourse, the policy discourse, students' unions are very much kind of portrayed as professional and student voice and things like that. So it's not positioned as a conflict discourse, I suppose. Don't know. I mean, that's my initial reaction, but it would be worth to actually look into the relationship, how the different levels interact.
Okay, maybe.
Thank you very much. It's a lot to kind of pack. So at the moment, I have two questions. The first question is really quick. So, what is your actual definition of discourse? Which I find this notion of discourse as space of functioning for subject fascinating, and then I can see that. So, I mean, just to move on to the second question, I will be kind of nice for you to define the term. Some of us will be like, I don't know, it's kind of fuzzy term anyway. So discourse for me is kind of very Foucauldian, Faircloughian. Fairclough's critical discourse and has very much relied on kind of Foucault's ideas of discourse. Discourse is a social practice. Discourse that is more than language. So it's not just linguistic, but it has its roots in whatever the historic traditions, but also certain effects. So through discourse, we construct the process, we construct the meaning, but also ourselves. I don't know if it makes any sense. So, I mean, almost kind of. So, I'm just trying to unpack in my own kind of language and trying to translate kind of essence out of it. So, just kind of double check if that makes sense, and then I will just add some more to make it clear. So, it looks like it's the basic thing that you're telling us is that are certainly multiple discourses existing. And it's almost like, although you just kind of lighter part of the presentation focus on the officers, but when it comes to students, in terms of why student actions are not very explicit nowadays, like so kind of making connection that like can we just argue that students in different groups or class structure or like students are like very homogeneous groups of people nowadays, like they're like coming from one set of historical background, and then it can be we can argue that a student may live in different dominant discourses, the different group will kind of buy into different dominant discourses, and then the subjectivity that they will, although there's a variety of different subjectivities they mention in those documents, but like each kind of student group will buy into one specific and then try to act out it, but because of that, they could only see it. Because another thing that students try to be self-regulated learning, and then now we're trying to really put the power within the classroom. So there are a lot of layers of discourse. Can we just see that, like the multiplying discourses around students and structure? Can we see like that in your work? Yes, I think, I mean, absolutely. I like your kind of the reason which you summarized it in terms of the kind of the competing discourses. So yes, I think, and it's, and that's why there is a dominant discourse, obviously, and that's kind of within, if you look at the higher education policies, that kind of neoliberals, market-based, consumerist dominant discourse. But it intersects with lots of other discourses from the past, discourses of kind of student-centered learning and things like that. And yes, through that, then we buy into certain narratives and we enact those things. So I suppose, yes, I agree with that. And I've lost the question.
Yeah. So if I try to make that question back to your title presentation, let's say we try to understand student activist, how student actions are related to political counter movement, and then can we just simply put, can we just say that students are buying into certain type of discourses? Those are people not very interested in kind of apparent political actions, or
yes, and that's absolutely. And I think that's one of the bits of work I've tried to kind of propose doing. So I've done a number of grant applications to extend that work and looking at taking that broader to students, because the things that I was speaking about student body in generally is very conceptual level, and some of the other people's research, but I myself have only done work with those sabbatical officers, so it actually would be interesting to see how does that apply to general student population, and what mediums they find to interact with issues like that.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, listening to the seminar, it reminded me of an incident here at Lancaster last term, which I thought was quite interesting and sort of relevant to several of the points you made. In Lancaster, we have Students' Union owns a nightclub in the town.
I heard about that yesterday.
Yeah, and it was put up for sale, sort of, essentially. And I used to write for the student newspaper, and we did an article on it based on a freedom of information request, where we got lots of the internal university documents about the sale of the nightclub, which is a students' union property, not a university property. And there were several sort of aspects of that, with the involvement of the senior staff of the students' union sort of overriding the views of the sabbatical officers, which was quite interesting. Particularly in the trustee board, there was a vote where the non-elected student trustees, external and student, outvoted the sabbatical officers over to sell it. And there was also a quote that we discovered in the FOI that was quite interesting from the head of estates, who wrote to the header of estates, someone more senior, and said that there's a lot of ill feeling amongst the SU elected officers who are undoubtedly stirring it up, which I thought was quite interesting. Sort of the perception of the role of the SU officers, I think, as staff officers.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting because, obviously in some student unions there is a possibility for extending the sabbatical officers term of office to the second year, but that's the nature, the 1 year rules. So it's almost like it has a limited history, and I suppose it's very easy to exploit that situation by the kind of professional side of the things, because you can overrule that, knowing that if somebody is a difficult person, you get rid of them within a year, and you just have to hold on that strategic whatever the oversight they have. So it's quite interesting, but but it's interesting. So do you know what was the motivation for selling that sugar house?
So I think it was never really clearly presented, but I think the summary is that nearby the nightclub, there's various developments going on to create new student accommodation. Very close, within about 50-metre radius, there's I think 2 now, and there's 2 more planned. And so the concern is noise complaints, I think, is that they were thinking they want to sell it before they get noise complaints, because the way that the whole legal system works with regards to that is that it's very likely it would get shut down if that happens.
Okay, so it's interesting. So yes, and the whole legal framework that comes into play in all kinds of ways.
And student housing isn't owned by the union, it's all private.
No, it's private.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So yes, interesting example.
Do we have any questions? Okay, so I have a few questions. But first one is more, I guess, also related to your conceptual, is sort of consumer engagement always political action in this new framework of yours?
Interesting.
And because, I'm not really, I see where you're coming from this kind of traditional activist kind of identity approach, and then trying to think of, say, like, not romanticize the past, but think about just new ways and forms which I like. But I'm not convinced that this will always be the case. So then, just that quote that you had on one side where there was this comment from one of the student unions about, this kind of grassroots activism, how this is being lost. So this, and maybe I would sound romantic now, but this, this shift from students as partners in governance of universities, where they were to the bigger or lesser extent political, but in the sense of like being legitimate partner in discussions about everything towards consumers, where they are discussing and claiming things consumption related. So, you know, getting free copy for students is something completely different than discussing, you know, I don't know, where universities will invest in, you know, in pensions or whatever. And then just, you know, just in terms of the union, of what was asked before, you know, where is then this shift if the unions are now almost like a unit of the university? Because, you know, this kind of, as you said, from the 60s, if universities have starting pro, they were there to support actually this governance and activism and so on. So can we see the shift where they became more kind of part of the university to become sort of like a part of provider of student experience together with the university in partnership, as opposed to being, you know, this kind of student voice representation? And does that have to do with marketization or not? Or, you know, it's a lot, I know.
I'll start with the last one because, I mean, I may be wrong, but my kind of the ways in which I have traced it really relates to the £9,000 fees. So it's 2010-11. After that student demonstration, that's what, because obviously, you know, £3,000 was a lot to pay for fees as well. But with that 9,000, and that's when you look into, you know, if you do some discourse analysis or any kind of reading of those policy documents, you can see how the value for money and student voice and all these kinds of things become particular in terms of protecting the investment and making sure that it's protected from that angle. So that's my thought, when probably there were also shifts in terms of how the universities then started to interact with student unions. I suppose it won't open up overnight, but that's my kind of thought. Going back to the very first question, our conceptual question, which I think is really interesting, and that's what I've been thinking about as well, because I suppose I may have come across, and from a Foucauldian perspective, I suppose you could argue that yes, that everything related to consumerism then becomes political as well. But I agree with you, and I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't want to, you know, argue that students suing a university over whatever they didn't receive is necessarily a political act. I think we get, and I think for me at this stage, I mean, I need to kind of work on that a bit more. I don't opt into Arendtian kind of traditional, conventional idea of political action, because then very few of us would be politically active. But I think there needs to be an element of collective benefit, collective interest. So if you use consumer logic, consumer rights, to do something good collectively, it probably is a political act from my view. If you do that to protect yourself, individual, yes, maybe in some cases has political implications, but it's probably more of a private matter. I think that's my kind of thinking around that, which is probably not so straightforward, and I may need to
yeah. Oh, sorry. Just
that's all right. Just a little bit.
Yeah. But then also the question is then, you know, okay, if some of this kind of consumer engagement is a political act, do we see a shift in terms of what it is about? You know, does it still because as I said, you know, if it's this kind of broader sense of the role of university, how it's all governed, and towards much more kind of concise, you know, still related to students and fighting for students, but more utilitarian, if you will.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, and I think it all goes down to the purposes of universities then, I suppose, as well. And some of the things, because I want to do another bit of work that I'm kind of preparing, is looking into kind of student governance more broadly, and the ways in which student representatives, whether they're student union representatives in university boards and senate and things like that, or then the course representatives in the education department level, what is their actual power and role? And often they don't have any, and you know, very limited in terms of the kind of how the tokenistic ways of managing that, because that serves the utilitarian purpose of the university. They're not actually interested in the actual student voice. It's a controlled voice, I suppose.
I mean, it's kind of interesting that the way that question was asked was like kind of clarify some of my questions. So I mean, that's exactly. And for me, every single actions I'm buying into Foucault. So I think people, no matter what whether they're conscious or not, they're a political being, and being contributing to discourse. Because whether even including the student who is suing university, just like really their behavior all kind of at the end of the day for me not necessarily the action itself, but like impact of those action, impact of discursive effect of someone's behavior. So student being self-regulated, learning itself is like, I see it as very political engagement, even in the system they try to do for their own sake. So for me, that's why it's very kind. I find yours presented really interesting, because students are buying into almost like visualized, if you want to visualize, the students are buying into staying, and then their field of action, the field of possibility for their action is all kind of controlled by their own discourse among many different things existing. And students, I think every single student nowadays, because they're really spicy, they're really trying to get there because of, and then they're unconsciously, they do a lot of things that they think is important for as a student. But some of them will come across as student activists. I'm fine with that, but that's not me. And then other people, sometimes I do have problem with this. People say, oh, current students are not very political because they don't engage with the government at all. Because for me, that's a very narrow sense of political action. And then so I do think that, kind of coming to your kind of question, that I really enjoyed that conversation. But I think it's even consumerist behaviors can be considered in very broad term as political action, especially when we see those impact of discourse impact that those behavior will create, going back to neoliberal discourse and make it more stronger and making more dominant, and that's the student role. That's the subjectivity of students.
Yeah, I mean, yes. So you could, you could look into the both ways, I suppose. So I was trying to look into, could they use consumer logic and you know, maybe not buying into it, but use it to reverse neoliberalism, but also they could actually enforce that through really believing into that, and that could be political being as well. And that's quite interesting, because, and I think you nicely highlighted, which I problematized in some of my work, looking into the construction of students as snowflakes. So this idea as well that, you know, they should be active consumers, they should know their rights, things like that, but then suddenly they're portrayed as snowflakes who don't want to engage with difficult ideas, they're depoliticized and things like that. And that's kind of interesting conflict there in terms of that. And that's the kind of, I think the idea behind the construction of students as snowflake is if they don't do exactly what is expected from that agency, it doesn't comply, then it's not there. Well, it's probably not the case. So yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. But yes, there's an element of self-regulation in any action, I suppose, which is important.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, you know, when we're talking about the construction of students as consumer, you know, we should also talk about the construction of the union as a partner, you know, with the university in the provision of student experience as opposed to something else.
Yeah, absolutely, and how it fits into that kind of network and kind of, you know, how it's situated. And it's, you know, Rachel Brooks wrote that interesting paper not like some time ago when she had a project of student unions looking into almost the geography of student unions, where are they placed in universities. And, you know, it's, when I did the project as well, it tells you so much before you even enter if you see the building. But, you know, what is their role in the university and how much power they actually have. Some student unions have enormous swimming pools or a number of different bars and, you know, things like that, and or where they're located on the campus. So it's always kind of that. It's also to do with the place and this, how that's constructed in terms of yeah.
There you go, Lancaster is right next to the main office.
I suppose there is a question about geography of student unions, because a lot of the student unions are based in separate buildings, where they have sort of a social club as well. And at Lancaster, it's literally A and B floor of the university house. Part of that is the student union, so it's not really reinforcing any sort of separation. It's quite interesting, really.
Absolutely. So this is fascinating. Absolutely. And then obviously in places like, I didn't do any field work in Durham, or neither in Lancaster, but in collegiate universities, it's also very interesting that student unions, it might be very, you know, very kind of elitist institution, but student union is constructed in a very particular way because it's not interested to dominate over the college. The student interest is, and student activism is taking place elsewhere in some ways. And then what the role of student union is, it's very much about quality assurance.
I mean, can I ask a question? Sorry, I was like, when it comes to your interview, because I did Foucault's analysis of teachers' perspective and teacher subjectivity in open universities. And the one thing that I find very interesting is teachers. That's why it's kind of students choosing what the dominant discourse that they want to believe in their life, because they experience just like conflicts in their life, because there are a lot of people saying different things in terms of how being studenty is, and then they eventually stick to one because they can't really live with this all confusing situation. And that happened to my teachers when I interviewed them. So eventually they became radically like, I hate technology, I just want to do it because it's very difficult for them to do both. And then when people, I love technology. So based on your interview, because all those people, although there was the collective voices you presented, seems like one part and the other part, they have slightly different kind of discourse going on in terms of their relationship against or with students. How they manage that conflict.
Yeah, it is, and I suppose what I did, because it was messy, and it was like, for me, and often when I work with kind of Foucauldian tools or doing discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis, what I tend to do is that I tend not to even look, I do look for dominance and kind of what's the dominating discourse, but I often try to show conflicts, because it seems like we all speak in a very conflicting way. I can contradict myself in most sentences when you argue. So what I try to show is that actually how they construct themselves is often very contradictory. It's very interdiscursive. They draw on political events, they draw on professional discourses, evidence, and they speak about still, doing something good for students. So I think there is the messiness, and often it's very difficult to pinpoint down then, this is exactly what they believe in, because those are, and that's why for example, I don't use the term, I hope I didn't use here either, that, that there are neoliberal universities. I think universities are neoliberalized, which I like much more, because there's still elements of liberal values, there's contradictions there. So it's very difficult to say that it's one, because those discourses are just mismatching, I think.
Okay. So thank you very much, Rille. It was really a great talk and discussion. Thank you everyone for participating. Just to say that this room is available until 2:30 if some people want to stay and continue the conversation. And the next seminar is happening next week, Wednesday, 19th of February. It will be presented by Dr. Carol Binns from University of Bradford on academics from working class heritage, ghosts of childhood habitus. So thank you.